Let's talk about Milio. With Yumi's midscope freshly released, Enchanter players are given another new toy to play with in Milio, a champion bringing a very surface-level simple kit with a lot of interesting optimization points. As usual, I got together with my community to test Milio, working to develop as much of his playstyle as possible pre-release. In this video, we will be covering Milio's abilities, ability usage, skill point distribution, purpose and playstyle, viable archetypes, counterpicks, synergies, roles, itemization, and runes. Milio's passive empowers allies with a burst of extra damage. On affecting himself or an allied champion with an ability, Milio enchants the target for 4 seconds. While enchanted, their next basic attack or ability deals an additional burst of magic damage and applies a magic damage burn over 1.5 seconds. The burn cannot stack, its duration is refreshed if applied multiple times. The burst deals damage based on a percentage of the enchanted target's AD. The burn deals a flat value scaling off Milio's level. There is no per target cooldown on this effect, and all damage counts as belonging to the champion that applied it. Milio's Q is a linear skill shot that knocks an enemy back, then bounces to apply damage and a slow in an area. The initial skill shot has a quarter-second delay, only strikes one target, deals no damage, and knocks back and stuns over 1 second. On collision, the bounce flies towards the target's knockback point, splashes as AoE magic damage, and slows enemies for 1.5 seconds. If the initial skill shot does not collide, the splash will not occur. If the primary target is a non-champion, the knockback is longer and the radius is larger. Regardless of target, the Q knockback will search for more targets in a small cone, and choose its direction to optimize the number of enemies hit by the splash. Milio's W is an area-targeted heal over time that follows and empowers allied champions. On summon, the zone selects the nearest allied champion to follow. Milio can declare a new primary target at any point by recasting, but only if the target is within his initial cast range. The zone persists for 6 seconds, and if Milio is its primary target, it moves noticeably faster. All friendly champions are healed per tick and granted increased base attack range while inside. If an ally leaves the zone, the attack range buff persists until their next auto attack or until W's duration ends, whichever comes first. W can also apply Milio's passive up to 3 times, once on initial cast and again every 3 seconds. Milio's E is a targeted shield that grants movement speed to the target. Milio can hold up to 2 charges of this ability. The effects stack if double cast, and double casting fully refreshes the duration of all effects. The movement speed will hold for its full duration even if the shield is destroyed. Milio's R is an AoE heal and cleanse. On cast, Milio instantaneously heals all allied champions around himself, cleansing them of non-airborne CC and granting heavy tenacity for 3 seconds. This ability has a short wind down period. You cannot cancel its animation with other spells. Milio cannot cast his ultimate if he is CC'd, and the instantaneous cast prevents any interactions similar to the Self Mikhail's. Though Milio has 2 abilities that can be explained fully in 30 seconds, he still has some important ability usage principles to go over. His Q has a cast delay, but this isn't a cast time, making Q flash an impossible interaction. The cast delay makes it very difficult to answer dashes on reaction. You must do so on prediction, so try to find an angle from which the enemy will be hit either way, or you're wasting your primary disengage spell. Your Q bounce from a minion is very unreliable onto champions and can always be dodged if the enemy is moving. You must catch an enemy in a last hit or cast animation to have any hope of landing this. W can be spent for raw healing if necessary, but it's ideal to use its range extension within a trade during the lane phase. Be mindful that casting W alone onto your ADC is likely to lead to only 1 or 2 auto attacks. Because of Milio's relatively short auto range, the AD scaling properties of his own passive, and the long charge cooldown of his E, it's usually not ideal to spend resources on applying his passive burn yourself, except of course in an enchanter duel. Putting it all together leaves Milio with exactly 1 proactive contribution and 2 offensive optimization points. He relies on the agency of his carry to output damage, opening with EW if they would have a carry-initiated trade opportunity. To cheat out as much damage as possible, Milio needs to be aware of how quickly his passive can be procced. His passive can be applied by autos or abilities that are in transit at the moment of being enchanted, but he needs to wait until that auto or ability lands before enchanting again. So if offense is Milio's sole purpose in a trade, he should wait to cast his W until his first E's proc is spent. You intend to spend the procs from E, W, E, W tick, W tick, and you can choose to spend Q through your ally before the final W tick, but it's rare that you're hard optimizing for passive DPS. Your defensive numbers are strong, and dumping a double shield for movement speed can be the better offensive optimization within a trade. As far as Milio initiated trades go, assuming no absurd enemy mistakes, you only have the option to Q an enemy in animation and immediately EW your ally to capitalize. Please be aware that casting your spells offensively creates windows in which your enemy can retaliate since your cooldowns are so long, so it can be correct to play a very passive role in lane, exploiting your intense shield values. There's no shortage of complications within Milio's skill order either, so let's start with the most basic points. Every one of Milio's spells offers a very enticing property for the skill points alongside a drawback. Q offers significant damage per rank. The drawback is the unreliability of the spell and the significant mid-game power trough you experience by failing to invest into your utility spells. Q is not our first max. W offers a noticeable increase to its range extension and to its healing, but the extreme cooldown limits the value of skill points during the early lane phase. E is by far our best trading tool. Remember that every value improved with skill points is effectively doubled since we have 2 charges, but that includes the mana cost. Full maxing E can introduce some mana barriers, so what do we do? Let's take it one level at a time. If E is our best trading tool, then it's our default at level 1. E at 1 can lead to either Q at 2 or W at 2, depending on whether the disengage for safety or the range extension for trading would be more important. We also have the option to take Q at level 1, which sacrifices trading power in exchange for better wave clear. Minions can't dodge this spell. This is likely a necessary optimization in some ranged matchups and would always be followed by E at 2. Though we cannot afford to invest heavily into Q, a second point is not inherently a problem as long as we're aware that it's not poke, it's wave clear and anti-engage trading power. 2 points in our E heavily outvalues Q, but only for the first trade, as most initiators won't wait a full 34 seconds for both of your charges to be restored before trying to trade again. We can't invest further into our Q without encountering our power trough, as our W does need points by the mid-game, and we don't have the luxury of solo lane XP. We will generally be investing our points into E until level 6, then we have to decide whether W or E max first is most important. I found that fully maxing E becomes outright oppressive into single target engage comps, and the movement speed can become very appealing when enabling mid-game bruisers. Otherwise, I would default to putting post 6 points into W, which is a greater investment into the effectiveness of your backline and your output towards your entire team. If you are playing in a siege comp, the range increase is critical. The conclusion is that the standard skill order for Milio is 3E, W, E, Q, but that there are a lot of per game decisions to make with your skill points. Milio is a defensive enchanter who denies picks and single flank engages, enabling his allies to reposition while amping their damage and reach. Ultimately, Milio has value for his cleanse alone. His auxiliary strengths of best-in-class movement speed, of range extension, of damage amplification, and of minor disengage all take time to come online and don't strictly need to be drafted around. His CC disengage is nowhere near the strength of Janna's, his laning is not as powerful as Lulu's, and his scaling is not as extreme as Sona's, but his shield does outvalue other enchanters if both charges are committed, and nobody shares his unique strengths. And I do want to reiterate that Milio is a very defensive enchanter. All offensive optimizations that I've shared are the result of hard limit testing a champion that really has to spend much of his lane phase waiting for someone else to make a move or a mistake. Your primary goal while playing this champion is to scale into the mid-game, when your cooldowns finally get low enough to use them more liberally and it doesn't feel as punishing to spend E charges on enabling a frontliner to charge forwards. By mid-game teamfights, it's likely not worth spending your attention on hard passive optimization, instead prioritizing appropriate use of your spells for their own merits. Milio's greatest strength beyond his cleanse is his ability to enable his allies to contribute under conditions in which they would ordinarily struggle to enter a fight. It just requires appropriate distribution of your shields, speed, range, healing, and CC, guided by awareness that your range is not high and that your positioning generally needs to lean towards your most important allies. You're not solely a teamfight champion as Milio either. Though obviously he's excellent in and primarily geared towards teamfighting, he also has some very potent control aspects. In particular, Milio's W and potential disengage gives him unique value within siege archetypes. Range extension becomes much more usable by a mage in the context of attacking turrets, and the rest of Milio's repositioning tools are valued heavily by a style of play that wants to prevent a fight from breaking out around objectives. If you want to prevent Milio from making it to the mid-game, you have a number of great options. Milio is completely dysfunctional into hyperpoke lanes. His extreme cooldowns and high mana costs leave him unable to neutralize effectively and force his partner to coin flip for any potential advantage. Drafting any mage support or select marksman supports should work wonders. Initiators are conditionally capable of breaking Milio's lane phase. It's very hard to take committal 2v2 trades into a Milio who holds his shield and Q cooldowns, but if you can force him to spend them without trading too much HP, you have massive re-engage windows which should swing the lane heavily. Introducing a jungler for a 2v3 is very strong, as Milio can only disengage on one flank at once, and the extra damage penetrates his double shield. Be aware that since Milio will need to hold his spells to disengage, he can't access his wave clear. He should lose prio, and he will very likely find roam advantages. If Milio is offered a scaling handshake, regardless of whether that comes from a weak laning bot laner, an enchanter, or a warden matchup, he will always accept that, and since his lane phase is his most exploitable period, you're not thrilled about offering that to him. For Milio to more reliably make it out of the lane phase, he needs to pick his own partner well. Milio must have a lane partner who declares the objectives of the lane for him, and he doesn't care whether that's a high agency ADC or a neutralizer. As far as high agency ADCs go, Draven is outstanding. Milio is given someone who loves to run in themselves, who optimizes his passive and who values his shield, while Draven is given a version of Sona who can actually contribute to his lane. Alternative options can be Lucian and Kalista. Note that Lucian doesn't have abusive vigilance interactions with W. Neutralizers, defined in this case as bot lane partners who don't need special help in forcing the enemy to slow down, can gain very high value from Milio. Ashe and Sivir in particular both synergize very well with many of Milio's properties. Caitlyn can become abusive off Milio's range extension, but Milio himself doesn't provide optimal laning conditions for her, and Caitlyn is likely to activate Milio's worst matchups, so it's not a pairing you should force. If Milio is offered that scaling handshake, his partner becomes a lot more flexible. At that point, any generic hypercarry would enjoy having Milio. His synergy requirements are entirely a symptom of his own laning weaknesses. If those become irrelevant, he has no explicit demands of his partner. The implication of everything I've said about laning is that Milio is not a flex pick. This is a support-only champion. His Q cooldown is far too high for mid lane Milio, and his base stats are too poor for normal top lane Milio. With roaming top lane strategies still conditionally functional, it could be worth exploring Milio as a Janna substitute, but we have not taken the time to do so. As a support, your hard backline positioning, scaling nature, and itemization should set heal and flash as your standard summoner spells. A stubborn ADC makes exhaust a valid substitute. A high agency partner and an engage matchup activates ignite. Uniquely, massive amounts of AoE CC put a target on your back and can create cleanse value to unlock your ultimate. For itemization, oh look, it's unmodified standard enchanter itemization. Now, Milio has very high cooldowns and an extreme need for ability haste, so it's worth asking why he doesn't itemize like Renata, who does not follow standard principles in favor of lucidity boot rushes and regular dips into tank items. The answer is simply that Milio gains very high value from his mythic options and has no reason not to opt into heal shield power afterwards. Milio has excellent Shirellia synergy and can situationally use Moonstone well despite his long cooldowns thanks to the long duration and short tick rate of his W. Milio does struggle a lot to proc spell thieves in the general case, so unlike his peers, he should default to Relic Shield. Besides that, we've been over this many times before, it's on screen, you know what to build. Runes get a bit more interesting thanks to an unusual devaluation of Aerie. Milio has a very hard time proccing Aerie offensively, and though it can repeatedly bounce to W targets, that implies that it's better to hard optimize for defenses. So after testing, I settled on a generalist Guardian sorcery page. I would switch back to Aerie in an instant for short-ranged enchanter matchups to gain access to Inspiration secondary. Anecdotally though, Guardian heavily outperformed Aerie defensively. We must opt into sorcery if our primary page is resolved because the ability haste from Transcendence is far too important to give up. We should also always take the ability haste minor rune. Monoflow Band is difficult to proc, but we're not getting extreme Gathering Storm or Scorch value either, so it remains best in slot. It is worth noting that some high pressure engage matchups that force you into Emax can heavily tax your mana and break your lane phase. In those cases, I do wonder if Biscuit Delivery is actually worth taking. I'm a big cookie hater, so that's a major statement coming from me, but be aware that this is untested speculation and would force us away from Transcendence. It's a very real trade-off. So that's Milio, the Gentle Flame. He has a lot of unique properties that we considered optimizing around before realizing that an AoE cleanse inherently has value. Like Renata before him, he gives the impression of not really trying to compete with the rest of the roster as a generalist enchanter, but unlike her, he's not exactly locked to a specific niche. He's no Lulu, but he's no Janna either. Milio is a compelling addition to the enchanter roster, restricted only by his own conditional weaknesses, offering high strategic value in draft, but never feeling completely horrible to deal with. While I expect his solo Q value to be low based on the coordination required to unlock him in lane phase, enchanter players in Flex, Clash, and Amateur play should thoroughly enjoy their new champion. As usual though, this is only a day one guide, which means our understanding of Milio's mid-game and matchups can always be pushed further. Please feel free to share what you discover in the comments below to help everyone learn. Thank you to my patrons, SonicX5040, Mel7401, Hailfire, and Sorazin. Your continued support makes these videos possible.